like to call the Budget Committee to order. Are there any declarations of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, okay, thank you very much. Opening marks will go to Mr. Murray.
There we go. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. So a full day, and so we're embarking on our 2019 budget process. I would say staff have been at this for months, and sort of major milestone to get the information in front of council, and pretty significant presentation this afternoon by Mr. Dyer that'll give you a pretty comprehensive overview of the 2019 budget. But I just wanted to start off with my usual, few opening comments, and some of the councillors who I've had a chance to meet with since the election have probably heard parts of this, but I just think there's a few important kind of messages to keep in mind. Like every year, we've got some challenges in front of us as we work our way through the 2019 budget. They include base budget pressures, infrastructure funding, service enhancements, and just an overall kind of category of uncertainty. So I'm going to just talk briefly about each of these. So base budget. So from a staff point of view, the base budget is what's the budget required to achieve the same level of service that we've had over the past year. And so there are some things putting upward pressure on the base budget. One significant thing is annualization of service enhancements, service expansions in 2018, in particular related to transit service expansion and paramedic service expansion. We've got a whole range of service contracts. Many of those service contracts have sort of automatic escalators built in. Waste management contracts are one example, that as the number of stops increase, as the tonnage of waste increases, there's automatic escalators built into those contracts. So that's putting upward pressure on the base. Craig will talk a little bit more about the whole challenge of dealing with core area development charge exemptions and a funding strategy that this council put in place over the last year to deal with an anticipated spike in core area development charge exemptions. And then a whole host of other issues, things that we buy. We buy fuel, we pay utility costs, we buy all kinds of materials, bus parts, for example, and there's just upward inflationary pressures on all of the things that we buy. So, infrastructure funding. This will probably be a significant theme through this year's budget. You'll hear it from me, you'll hear it from Craig. And in this community, we have the dual challenge of dealing with existing infrastructure and new infrastructure. On the existing side, we've got well in excess of $4 billion worth of built infrastructure that we have to maintain, renew, upgrade, replace as it wears out. And what I would say is, in our current budgets, there is not enough annual operating capacity, annual contributions to capital to deal with all of those state of good repair infrastructure works. And as a result, we're borrowing money to repair and replace aging infrastructure, which would, in our personal lives would be akin to taking out a second mortgage to replace the roof. So that's, something that we need to continue to find more sustainable funding sources for. So existing infrastructure, that's one challenge. And we also continue to grow as a community. So we need to continue to provide the infrastructure to serve that growing community. Road capacity, water, wastewater capacity, transit vehicles, the list goes on. Much of that is intended to be funded through development charges, and what I would say is development charges currently don't totally cover the cost of that growth-related capital, either because of timing issues. We have to build something up front and we collect for it over many years, debt finance it and collect for it over many years, or there's not adequate capacity built into the development charges themselves. So those are a couple of challenges on infrastructure. Service enhancements. So in your package, you got a package of budget issue papers, and that's typically been our approach to deal with program and service enhancements through a series of budget issue papers. I would say this year there are probably more than in previous years. Some of them are similar to issues we've dealt with in the past. Implementing a whole series of master plans. So the Paramedic Services Master Plan, adding ambulances, adding paramedics. The Grand River Transit Business Plan, continuing to expand transit service. Mobility Plus Business Plan. So a whole series of business plan and master plan implementations. And then we see service enhancements that are driven by either changing demographics or growth in the community. So the one example, changing demographics, aging population, you had the presentation this morning from the folks at Sunnyside Home. We're seeing a dramatic shift in the kinds of residents we get at Sunnyside and the complex needs that they have. So that's driving a need for increased staffing to maintain safety at Sunnyside. As the community grows, we add road capacity, we add traffic signals. So then at some point, the number of traffic signals get to a point where the crews we have can't keep up, and we need to add crews. So you'll see a budget issue paper on that. And then the last category, I would just call it organizational capacity. As the, all of our programs expand, services expand, we need to look at our internal organizational capacity. IT support is one big area. Facility support is another area. Asset management. So those are sort of broad categories of budget issue papers that you'll have to deal with over the next couple months. And then the last factor, I think, sort of cloud hanging over the 2019 budget process, I would just say, is uncertainty. There's federal and provincial infrastructure funding programs. We talked about it this morning. The status of those is unclear. The timing and the process for applying for and getting approval for funding on those big infrastructure funding programs is uncertain. Provincial policies and funding, also uncertain. There will be a provincial budget sometime in the spring. The region gets about $270 million a year of provincial funding. So that just creates some exposure, some risk. And then just uncertainty in, again, the things that we buy, and where are they going to land. The last thing I want to talk about is, as I shine a light on this every year, is there is a huge amount of work that goes on at a staff level before council sees the budget to make sure that we are being as efficient as we possibly can. And so we continually look for, we call them base budget adjustments, and that's things that can be done without impacting service levels. And so this year, as in years past, we've identified over $2 million of sustainable base budget reductions, some of it in the tax levy supported area, others in the user rate supported areas. And you can see over the last 5 years that totals up to in excess of $12 million in sustainable base budget reductions. And some of the categories that we're finding those budget savings in are listed on this slide. But I think it's important to take that as the context, the background for the budget that's in front of council as a starting point. So that's my kind of little lengthier overview than you may have got in past years, but I just thought it was important to share some of those big picture thoughts. So if there are any questions, I'll try to deal with them, and then I'll turn it over to Craig.
Okay, just before we get to the questions, I'd just like to make a couple of comments, and then we'll get it started with Mike and Craig, because Mike's right into the presentation there. So just for committee's benefit and for new councillors, there's no decisions made today. This is for information and questions of clarification. So if you have any questions about what's being presented today and at subsequent meetings is the time to ask them. We will be making decisions starting at the next meeting, I think, with respect to the user rates. And then final budget day, which would be 3 meetings from now. We also have some public input sessions along the way. So a lot of time to ask questions as we go through the process. Just to reiterate something that Mike said in terms of some of the pressures we're experiencing, A lot of it has to do with the annualization of master plans. So the reason we put into place airport master plan, regional transportation master plan, paramedics, EMS master plan, just to name a few. And then when we make enhancements, we back end those enhancements so they start in September of the previous year. And then the chickens, so to speak, come home to roost in the following year where we have to pay for all those improvements and services. And so that adds to our base position of a 1.85% starting position, which is on page 8 of 30 of our agenda. So that's the preliminary number, but I just wanted to add on to that, and then hopefully we'll be able to take some away, is that on top of that, there's going to be police, which could be roughly around 1% or maybe a little bit higher. We'll have to wait to hear back from the Police Services Board. And also the issue papers, which are at 1.6% right now, giving us an overall starting position of around 4% in terms of a tax increase. And so the committee chairs and senior staff have met along with Chair Redmond, and it's up to us if we want to reduce that 4%. My position as chair is that I think 4% is too high of a tax increase. There are some needs that we need to meet within the budget and provide services to our community, but we're going to have our work cut out for us as we go through this to find out where we can find those savings and pay particular attention to those issue papers, which right now are at 1.6%. So we have some work to do to bring that down from 4%. The other thing I'd like to say, and Mike touched on this, is in terms of the uncertainty. And it's really hard to plan for uncertainty from the provincial government. So our approach to this budget is we're developing a budget based on what we know today. That's all we can do. So we'll set this budget for 2019 based on what we know today. And likely when we start 2020 budget in the fall of 2020, we'll have more information from the province. We'll have a better idea of what's ahead of us from there. So I look forward to working with you all as we go through this process over the next couple of months and arrive hopefully at a consensus budget that everyone can support. Okay. So with that, Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chair. Question about the anticipated spike in development charge exemptions. Actually, two questions. And Mike's sitting down, but I'll just ask it to the room at large. So am I right in thinking that we're anticipating a spike because of the ending of the downtown exemptions? Okay. Yeah. And this is a real cost, right? We don't just, it's not just a bypassed revenue because we actually pay the exemptions. Okay. Thank you.
Right out of the tax base. Mr. Dyer? Okay. Councillor Galloway?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had a question in regards to the base budget adjustments Mr. Murray referred to. And I first want to just congratulate staff on doing that. As you can see, there's been quite a history of that. And it makes a substantial difference when we start the budget process. It's almost like 0.5% or more. Some years it's been more. And I know that sometimes we're told that all the low-hanging fruit has been taken away, but staff seem to be able to do quite a considerable amount each year. What I was interested in specifically, there's not a lot of detail here, and I'm not sure I want a lot of detail, but is there any way of characterizing the $2.2 million in supplies, other expenses versus staff? Because one of the 4 areas is reviewing and adjusting staffing levels, so I'm kind of just curious. I mean, and if you have to come back later, that's fine. I'm just curious whether or not of the $2.2 million, 10% is staff, 50% is staff, or whatever what it might be in those 4 categories.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. So yes, we can absolutely bring that back. We have a table, I think, that already exists. If it's acceptable, we'll bring it back as part of the report and presentation in January.
Okay, that's fine. And the reason I'm asking is in the budget issue papers, there's a lot of requests for staff, primarily, and we're going to have to look at that with a fine-tooth comb and, have to deal with some of those issues. So it's important to me to understand what we've done on the other side of the ledger to start off with. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Galloway. Mr. Dyer, I think you're on.
Well, thank you. Excuse me. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to Mr. Murray for his introductory remarks. He did such a nice job of summarizing my presentation. I'm a little concerned for my job at the moment. But with that...
Can you leave early today? Is that
that being said, I shall forge ahead and wish everybody a big welcome to the 2019 Region of Waterloo budget process. Over the next couple of months, we'll work through a number of meetings and presentations that will hopefully be helpful for you as a group in terms of determining the desired level of services and the overall budget for 2019. There's a fair bit of material in today's presentation, which is a couple of you have commented on before we started today. I'm happy to go through it as quickly or slowly as you wish. And I'll look to the committee chair to give me a sense of whether I'm going at about the right speed. But certainly, if there are questions at all as we go through, please feel free to ask them. The point of these presentations is again to provide you with the information that you need to make a well-informed decision on the budget when we get back together in the new year. So lots of information has been provided so far. You would have received a copy of, so included on the agenda today is a staff report, which goes through a number of the items that I will cover off in the presentation today, a bit of background, a bit of update on economic indicators, some discussion about the major factors that are impacting the region's budget as we head into 2019, and hopefully my presentation will touch on all of those high points. There's also a package of proposed budget issue papers, and I'll get in and describe a bit what those are. And there's also a copy of the budget document itself in a searchable PDF format rather. And so hopefully between all of that information and then successive reports and presentations that we'll provide, you'll be getting all the information that you need. All of the information available for the agenda today is also available on the region's website, including the preliminary budget document, the package of issue papers, and today's committee agenda. And so in terms of what we want to, I guess, accomplish today, so going back to Chair Strickland's earlier comment that this isn't a decision-making day, so this is just a lot of information being provided, and absolutely an opportunity for you to let us know what information you might need as we go forward through the budget process. So we're going to give you an overview of the 2019 operating budget and the 10-year capital program, talk about those major factors that are impacting the budget, and get any feedback that we can from this group today and also subsequent to today. Feel free to let us know if there's any other information you'd like to see, and we'll bring it back for you to the meetings in January. And so in terms of how we're going to accomplish this, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction. The introduction is a little more than I might normally do, but I thought it would just be a good opportunity, first budget for this term of council, just to go back through some of the basics of how we budget here at the region, talk about economic indicators, both the user rate, what we refer to as the user rate, and the tax-supported operating budgets, and then, of course, have an opportunity for questions. So by way of introduction, just a little bit of context. So in terms of the overall amount of tax revenue collected in Canada, the municipal portion represents about 9% of the total. So the decisions that we'll make here as part of the region's budget will then be a portion of that 9% of the total amount of government tax dollars raised. Looking at the region, looking at property tax bills within the region, this chart shows basically a breakdown of a typical residential property in the region of Waterloo. Regional services make up a little over 50% of the total. Local services provide just under a third, and then about 15%, which are education taxes, which of course are then forwarded on to the province of Ontario. So the part that we'll talk about here is that regional services piece. Now, just kind of at a fundamentally, I guess at a basic level, you know, what do we accomplish by doing a budget? Like, why do we go through the budget process each year? As we talked about earlier today in the A&F meeting, the Council will be undertaking a strategic plan process in 2019, as did the previous Council. And so what the region does and what is approved through the budget, you know, should lead towards achieving strategic objectives as defined by Council. Also establishes the service levels that will be in place both for the upcoming year and through the forecast period. Obviously, it approves both the financial and staffing resources in order for services to be delivered. It determines the property tax and revenue requirements. I'm going to go into each of these a little bit in a couple of slides. And then we also use it to set any user rates and fees. So as we go through each annual budget process, we'll accomplish each one of these items here on slide 14. And as Mr. Murray indicated, the budget itself is informed by a series of master plans. And so over the last 3 or 4 years, Council has approved master plans which set out the desired, I'll say, direction and service level for a variety of regional services. And we reflect those service levels in both the operating and the capital budgets. So over the last 3 years, we've had a paramedic services master plan, an airport master plan, business plan for Grand River Transit, both for its mobility service and its conventional service. Recently, as in 2018, the police facilities accommodation master plan was approved by the board. Wastewater and biosolids master plans approved by this Council, as well as by the previous Council, and most recently an updated transportation master plan. 2 that are underway right now is a regional accommodation master plan. So this is for regional facilities, and as the region grows and as we need more space in order to deliver services, we are working away on a master plan that will come forward to Council in 2019. And the Waterloo Region Housing Master Plan is currently underway and scheduled to come forward to this Council sometime, I believe, late in the second quarter of 2019. So these master plans set out service levels then reflected in the budgets. So budgeting at the region, and some of this is terminology update. Some of this is just to provide the context to the material that you're going to get when this group gets back together in January. We have what we refer to as user rate budgets. So these are our water supply, wastewater treatment, water distribution, and wastewater collection budgets. The region provides I guess a wholesale function, so we supply the water for all 7 municipalities and treat all the waste for all 7 municipalities. We also provide a retail function, so we're the direct service provider in 2 of the townships, being North Dumfries and Wellesley. Funding for the user rate budgets is exclusively from the user rates themselves, so the rates that are charged per cubic meter, as well as development charges. All of the other services that we provide are captured within the property tax budget. We go through a process of, accumulating the costs for all the services. We subtract from that the revenues in terms of user fees, in terms of subsidies, and the balance after all those deductions is what's funded from property taxes. And of course, this includes the police services budget. So we have a user rate budget and we have a property tax budget. We'll sometimes use the terminology a tax-supported budget. We often use that, and again, that just has the meaning of, just describes the property tax budget. So user rate and property tax, and within each of those, we have both a capital and an operating budget. So capital program, so it's a 10-year capital program that we do for all of our services. And this goes back to one of Mr. Murray's slides, the significant investment in capital assets that the region has done over the last many number of years, and that will be continuing over the next 10 years. So this is property acquisition, this is investment in facilities, in infrastructure, technology, equipment, vehicles, items that are, I would say like non-recurring, major projects, major initiatives. From a funding perspective, relatively small number of sources of funding to fund our 10-year capital program, grants and subsidies when they're available, development charges, and then the property tax and user rates that I discussed previously. On the operating side, so just a very different type of expenditure, this is where we'll cover what we would refer to all of our day-to-day type operating costs for delivering services. So compensation for staff, materials and supplies, social assistance services, the debt servicing costs, which we're going to talk about in some detail today, and even more when we get back together in January. Utilities, basically all your day-to-day costs of running the region. Again, from a revenue perspective, grants and subsidies when they're available, user fees and charges, and property taxes. We have a fairly small, narrow range, if you will, of revenue sources to fund municipal services. So this is your one math lesson for today. I'm going to keep it fairly simple. There's a more complicated one, which I think we'll do in January or February. But again, looking at each of these budgets, user rates and property taxes, here's how the math works. So in both cases, we determine the operating costs, the expenditures needed to deliver the service levels as established by council. We add to that funding for capital. So this is where we're generating funding specifically to fund capital projects, but also to pay debt servicing costs in situations where we borrowed money. We subtract from that any recoveries, grants, subsidies, user fees and charges, and what we're left with is what we sometimes refer to as a rate revenue requirement. On the tax side, we refer to it as the property tax levy, but it's basically how much revenue do we need to generate on the water and wastewater side, and how much revenue do we need to generate on the property tax side. And that determines our rate requirement and our property tax levy. And if we did take it one step further, that's basically the numerator in each case. On the water side, we would divide that by flows to get a rate per cubic meter. On the tax side, we would divide it by property assessment to get a rate per $1,000 of assessed value. So when we look at the types of revenues that we have to fund our operations, as I said, we have basically subsidies, user fees, property taxes. It's interesting to see how it differs by service. I've used this set of slides a few times. We're presenting it a little bit differently this time, so hopefully it's even clearer. I think it does a nice job of explaining how regional services are funded. So first of all, what we have here is a chart that shows the major regional services. It's not all-inclusive, but it captures most of them. And we're going to show how they're funded. So first of all, property taxes. Some services, highly, highly property tax dependent. Police services, transit, road repairs, waste management, all have, significant property tax levy contributions. You'll note that some don't, such as water and wastewater. The next thing we'll add in is provincial and federal subsidies. So we receive, and this is mostly provincial. It varies significantly by service. And you can see that in some cases we have services that are heavily dependent, heavily subsidized by provincial revenues, and others that aren't at all. Look at income support, for example. We've just finished a 10-year process of uploading Ontario Works costs to the province. And that's why we see such a significant provincial portion on the income support line. Other areas, senior services, public health, paramedic services, child care, also all heavily subsidized by the province. Roads, waste management, very little subsidy whatsoever. And then the third piece that we add on is the user fees and charges that I talked about. And here's where the water and wastewater services becomes quite obvious. water and wastewater funded exclusively through the user rate system. And then significant user fees in transit through fare revenue, to a lesser extent in areas such as senior services and waste management. So you can see from this we have a variety of different funding models for different services. And when we do have changes in funding from the province, it affects different services in a different way. I'm just going to keep moving along, Mr. Chair.
We do have one question. Councillor Clark.
Thank you. With regards to community housing and children's services, there might be some others in there. Are we simply here referring to our directly operated or the program as a whole?
It would refer to the program as a whole. Yes, absolutely. Yep. So in the case, if we use children's services as an example, this would include a significant amount of 100% provincial funding that's coming to the region. The region is then managing the distribution of that funding in the form of wage subsidy, fee subsidy, special needs, things like that, which you probably know much better than I do. Okay, so there's kind of a breakdown of how we fund the regional services. From a capital perspective, this is a bit of a duplication of Mr. Murray's slides. We've talked about existing infrastructure that needs to be maintained, renewed, upgraded, replaced. We have lots of new infrastructure that we put into place as the community grows and as needs and demands change. All of that factors into our 10-year capital program, which we fund basically through the same revenue sources that we just spoke about. And so if we take a similar look on the capital side, so this is taking the capital program for some of our major services. We have some that do receive grant subsidies and recoveries, particularly on the transportation and transit services side. So the transportation here is specifically the federal gas tax revenues that we receive for our roads program. We then add on property taxes, as well as any borrowing that we do that we fund from future property taxes. And then we add on development charges. So again, we have a different mix of funding for different services, so we don't have kind of a one-size-fits-all financing plan. And as you can see, we have certain programs that rely to a great extent on long-term borrowing. This is what we refer to as both non-growth and growth-related debt, and I've got some slides later on that will go into that in a bit more detail. With respect to our internal budget review process, as indicated earlier, we have been working on the 2019 budget for some time, and we go through a process of reviewing the 10-year capital programs, in many cases on a project-by-project basis. We look back through 3 or 4 years of actuals to look for trends, look for ways to adjust our budgets going forward, and we complete fairly detailed base budget reviews as well as reviews of our user fees and charges. And in terms of the overall budget cycle, this analysis has been underway for some time. We're at the point now where we have a preliminary budget document that was circulated on Friday. And we're about to start the committee review and public input part of the budget review. And that will lead us to approval in February of 2019. And then following budget approval, we then go into what we refer to as a variance monitoring and reporting process. So we report back periodically to Council through the year as to how things are playing out relative to the budget that was approved. And you'll see the first of those reports in the spring with a follow-up in the fall. And you will see probably in March, you'll see a year-end variance report from the 2018 fiscal year. And I should say before we leave this slide, you have the distinction of being able to go through the budget process twice in 2019 because we'll start the first meeting for the 2020 budget process will be in October of 2019 with a goal of completing the budget process by the end of December. Okay, a little bit about terminology before we get into some of the numbers. So we use the term budget issue paper. So what's a budget issue paper? It's simply put, it's a request, it's a service expansion request. It's where a proposal has been put forward for additional GRT bus routes, for additional paramedic services resources, for additional staffing resources at Sunnyside or in childcare or in one of the support areas. And we have a package of those issue papers, which has been circulated to you, that we'll go through in some detail in January. And is also required for staff additions. Our procedure or our policy here at the region is that staff positions don't get added without the explicit approval of council. And that happens either through a budget issue paper or through a standalone report over the course of the year. Not to be confused with a budget information paper, which is, I would say, a brief report covering some aspect of the budget. So when we come back to you in January, we'll have some budget information papers about the water and wastewater budgets. We'll go through it in some detail. We'll talk about expenditures, revenues, flows, trends, rate increases, all that. Again, just to give you the additional information that you need for decision making on the budget. Sometimes they're initiated by staff. Sometimes they're in response to questions that have been raised by councillors. And then the other term we wanted to cover is full-time equivalent. This is the term that we use to measure staff resources, or staff complement in this case. So basically, an individual working on a full-time basis is considered one full-time equivalent. We have in some of our divisions a large number of part-time staff, and so rather than showing the staff as a total employee count, it's a better comparison, at least over time, and between divisions and departments, to show them on an equivalent basis. So when we use the term FTE, you'll see that come up in a number of places. That's what we're referring to, a full-time equivalent position. I'm just going to pause there, Mr. Chair, before I head into some economic indicators, just to see if there's any questions before I move along.
Carry on.
Okay, thank you. Some of this we have covered off in the report. We usually do this at the start of the cycle. We talk a little bit about what's happening in the economic environment that is then affecting our budgets in some way or another. So a bunch of figures up here regarding deficits, inflation, unemployment, cost of borrowing, and oil. I'm going to focus on a couple of them. The first one I want to talk about is the provincial deficit. So a year ago, we were looking at roughly a balanced budget. What we have now is not the $6.7 billion budget deficit that was projected by the previous government, but now a newly calculated $14.5 billion deficit at the provincial level as a result of the work that was done over the last couple of months, and as confirmed through the fall economic statement a couple of weeks ago. From a trend perspective, just a few things to watch here. So inflation is increasing, pretty much a full % higher than it was a year ago. Unemployment rate has come up a bit, but still below the Ontario and Canada average. Ontario Works caseload has been increasing, has moderated a little bit in the last little while. And the 10-year cost of borrowing. 2 years ago, we were doing a 10-year regional debenture issue at 2.1%, currently sitting at about 3.1%. And oil. Oil has been all over the place in the last little while. $51 a barrel 2 years ago, currently at 51, but I've got a chart in a minute that shows what's happened in between. So inflation projections, these are the latest that we've seen as of October, looking at 2019. Most of the projections in the 2 to 2.4 range, BMO currently a bit of an outlier. We'll update these numbers as we go through the budget process and as these numbers update. But low twos, on average, what being projected right now for 2019. We talked about oil, so these are the three markers that were on the previous slide. 2 of them at 51 and 1 at 57. But you can see what's happened over 2018. Oil went from $50-odd a barrel at the start of the year to over 76 a mere 2 months ago, and then has completely fallen down to the $50 a barrel level in the last couple of weeks. So a significant pullback over the last 2 months. Fuel prices. Just a bit of a background. The region uses about $13 million a year of fuel, most of it diesel, through our Grand River Transit service, but about $3 to $4 million with respect to unleaded for our fleet, for paramedic services, for police services. This is what's happened to our cost over the last year. So what are we looking at here? So the blue line is year-to-date unleaded gasoline. So was up over $1.15. Has recently, in keeping with the oil price reduction, has come down well below the levels that we've been paying over the course of the year, and now down to just over 90 cents a liter. Diesel has come down, but not nearly as quickly. And it's interesting that diesel, currently at a premium, in some cases 20 to 25 cents a liter higher than unleaded. For the 2019 budget, we set our prices. So we set our prices probably 3 or 4 months ago at $1.03 a liter for both unleaded and diesel. So we recognize that we may need to take another look at this because we're currently at about 91, 92 cents a liter for unleaded. We're kind of bang on right now with respect to the current price and the price that we've assumed for the 2019 budget, but we will take another look at this and bring forward any further recommendations in the early part of next year. Cost of regional borrowing. So interesting chart here. This looks at the last 5 debenture issues that the region has completed. And so you can see the trend. Our cost of borrowing has been increasing since those extremely low rate issues in the fall of 16 and the spring of 17. So we've seen the cost of borrowing come up. But I would say, in the context, 10-year money at just over 3% is still a fantastic rate. And historically speaking, it's still a very, very attractive rate for municipalities to be borrowing at. So not a huge concern right now, but again, noting the trend over the last 2 years or so. Ontario Works caseload, which was between 8,000 and 9,000 cases per month for the longest time, and then at the start of 17 drifted up above 9,000 and has been between 9,000 and 9,500 over the last couple of years. Less of a concern from a regional budget perspective now that the upload is complete, but still one of those indicators that we watch. And so to summarize, significant federal and provincial deficits. Both of them have been, confirmed through the recent fall economic statements. Cost of borrowing is still low. Unemployment still relatively low. OW caseload is increasing. And, we're trying to figure out how to describe the cost of fuel. It's been volatile. Unpredictable may have been a better word than volatile. Because I'm not sure we would have anticipated the significant reduction we've seen over the last 8 weeks. Flammable. Flammable would have been even better. Absolutely. Okay, so with that, so there's a bit of introduction on how and why we do budgeting here at the region, a little bit of background on economic indicators. I think we'll get right in now into an overview of water and wastewater. So as I indicated earlier, we provide water supply and wastewater treatment, over 54 million cubic meters per year supplied through over 100 supply wells. I already talked about being the supply to all 7 municipalities. On the wastewater side, we have 13 treatment plants, and because we discharge into rivers and not to lakes, we're required to provide a higher level treatment than some municipalities might have to, for example, those who are on Lake Ontario and have a large lake in order to discharge. So 13 treatment plants which must be updated, maintained, upgraded, and operated on an annual basis. We approved the 2018 user rate budgets were approved last December. It's about $132 million, so order of magnitude, $132 million of rate revenue and about $1 billion 10-year capital program. The rate increases that were approved in the last budget, 1.9% for supply, 7.9% for wastewater treatment, and at the retail level, 7.9 and 5.9. Those came into effect early in 2019. Here's a first look at how the 2019 user rate budgets are shaping up from a revenue requirement perspective. And again, we take our expenditures, we add in our debt servicing and our capital reserve contributions, we back out any other revenues, and what we're left with is the rate revenue requirement. So thinking back to that slide from earlier in the presentation. And I know some of this I'm going to be going through quickly. January 16th, there will be a fairly detailed presentation about the water and wastewater budgets. And we'll go through this a little more slowly and in a little more detail. There are two issue papers, so again, two requests for service expansion, for lack of a better term, going into 2019. The addition of one staff position to ensure delivery of the source protection plan, and another one which is a conversion. So in situations where we want to convert a position from a temporary FTE to a permanent FTE, we also bring those forward for council to approve as part of the budget process. And this relates to some of the asset management work that we're doing in water and wastewater. The proposals for user rates for 2019, so these are the numbers in the far right-hand column of this table. Proposing 2.9% for water supply, 6.9% for wastewater, 7.9% for water distribution, and 4.9% for wastewater collection. And you can see that those estimates are exactly in line with what we had projected last year. So we do a 10-year water and wastewater rate model. What we're recommending for 2019 is unchanged from what we were proposing a year ago in 2019. In terms of the annual cost per household, so this is on water supply and wastewater treatment, about $453 in 2018. If the supply and treatment increases were approved as planned, that would add about $22 to the annual cost of water and wastewater across the region. And again, these are increases then that the municipalities would then build into their budgets for 2019, and we've communicated these rates to the treasurers of each of the municipalities, and again, unchanged from last year. On the capital side, about $480 million capital program. We have, sorry, it's a bit of an incomplete thought there, the middle one, $26 million for manganese treatment upgrades. That's the amount of debt that we're expecting to issue for manganese treatment over the course of the 10-year capital program. We have identified the need for about $86 million of growth-related debt. This is going to be a recurring theme that we're going to talk about through the budget process, and that as we go through a development charges update in the early part of 2019, that we'll be discussing further. Because this is debt that we would issue and would expect to recover or fund, rather, the debt servicing costs from future development charges. On the wastewater side...
Craig, just before we get to wastewater, we have a question on the water user rates. Councillor Galloway?
Well, just on the rate model, Mr. Chair, so we see the new rate or the projected rate, same as what was projected last year. Can I get the 10-year forecast?
Yes, in fact, it's in the preliminary book. We'll send you a page reference. In fact, we'll send one out to all of council.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Wastewater capital. So as I mentioned earlier, a new wastewater master plan was approved in 2018. Did have a significant effect on the 10-year capital program and had the effect of reducing it from a $600 million capital program to a $526 million capital program. And this was largely through the deferral of the next expansion at the Waterloo wastewater treatment plant. So the capital program, so again, just from a sequence of events perspective, master plan gets approved. The master plan then gets reflected in the capital program that is submitted to council for approval. And we have a very, very small amount of user rate supported debt required. I think we're in really good shape in terms of funding our asset renewal work on both the water and the wastewater side. Again, from a growth perspective, there's about $100 million of growth-related debt that we're anticipating to be needed over the next 10 years, we'll confirm or adjust that amount as we go through the development charge background study in 2019. So in terms of overall background, so rate increases consistent with the projections from last year. Growth-related debt requirements we're going to review as part of the development charges background study. And again, you'll have a detailed presentation on water and wastewater at the January 16th meeting. I'm going to move on to the tax-supported budget. So again, everything that isn't water and wastewater gets captured within the tax-supported budget. 2018 budget was approved back in December, had a 2.74% tax increase, and we had assessment growth of 1.93%. And if remember that number, because we'll come to a slide that compares this year's growth. So we had some debate at a staff level about where this slide should show up in the presentation. We figured there were probably a bunch of people around the table that would like to jump straight to the bottom line and know where are we at. So we thought we would open with that. So here's the current status of the tax-supported budget. So base budget, again, the amount required to achieve our current levels of service, has a 1.67% tax impact. I should watch my acronyms. RTMP, Regional Transportation Master Plan, is at 0.65%. This is the final year of the funding strategy for Stage 1 LRT and Grand River Transit service improvements. To that, we add the debt servicing and the contributions to capital and reserves, largely from an asset renewal perspective, adds another 0.85%, which puts us just under 3.2%. So a 3.2% tax increase on the assumption that, hang on, I've just lost my train of thought. Missing issue papers. Right, got it. Okay, so we take the 3.2%, we back off assessment growth. So assessment growth has come in at about 1.9%. That gets allocated between the region and the police, and so the net impact, leaving issue papers and police aside for the moment, is 1.85%. So going back to the chair's comments at the outset, if you're wondering sort of overall where things are at, the 1.85%, the budget issue papers, if they were all approved, would add about 1.2%. So that would take us to just over 3%. And if the police came in with a 1% tax increase, then that would take us to just over 4%. So that's the starting point, if you will, for the budget deliberations.
All right, thank you, Mr. Dyer. I'd just like to, a question on the debt servicing and contributions to capital reserves. We're going to get a more fulsome report on that at a future meeting.
You'll have a more fulsome slide in about 5 minutes.
Okay. I'm not sure if it'll be fulsome enough, but the one thing I wanted to point out to committee is that we'll hear more from Mr. Dyer on this, but that number is certainly, how shall we say it, negotiable. So it's up to us how much we want to put into the debt servicing and contributions to capital reserve. So even though it's in the base, it's not 100% given that that's going to go into the base. That's something we get to decide. All right, we've got a couple of questions. Councillor Erb.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you explain to me a little the regional share of assessment, the reduction in that? Is that based on an estimated growth and then backing it out?
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's a really good question. So it's actually based on actual growth this time. So the growth we're talking about here is the growth in the assessment base across the region. So again, just I always try to go back to math, but you know, I've got a numerator and a denominator to calculate my tax rate. The numerator is the tax levy. How much taxes in total do I have to collect? The denominator is how big is my assessment base? And so all other things being equal, if my assessment base is bigger, then my tax rate is lower. And so anytime we do the budget, we look at our expenditures, look to see how the numerator changes, how does the tax levy itself change. But each year there are new properties that are built, new expansions, increases in value that get captured in a larger assessment base. And so when we're calculating the impact on an individual property, then the fact that the base has gone up means the impact on an individual property has gone down. So it's exactly as you presented it. We take that, in this case, the 3.17%, and we back off, in this case, the region's share of that assessment base. It gets prorated kind of between us and the police. So the police have a certain share of that base based on their levy. We have a share of it, and overall, basically what it's saying is we don't need a 3.17% increase for the base. We only need for the base budget. We only need 1.85% because our assessment base as a whole has grown.
Thank you.
Hope that's helpful.
So, Councillor, a number of years ago, we established a formula, whatever the assessment growth was, that we would apportion a percentage to the regional base and a percentage to the police base. I think, was it 75-25?
It's about 68-32 right now.
Okay.
Right. It varies. Yeah.
Right. We have another question, Councillor Kiefer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Craig, just a few minutes ago, you were talking about the cost of diesel and gas, and I was wondering, are we looking at electrical vehicles at all, or if we switched over to some vehicles, cost savings there, or is that being done or not being done? I know we're looking at it from on the police services. They are doing something in that area.
So at this point, I'm not aware of a significant effort to do that. We do have a small number in our fleet, but I can provide some information back to you on that.
Thank you.
Okay, we have another question, Councillor Banovic.
Well, thank you. And two things in relation actually to the question that Councillor Kiefer just asked. Council recall that as a council we made a commitment to 80-50 in terms of an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050, and we know that the vast majority of that in terms of the things that we can immediately control actually come through our fleet. So I think two things are important. Number one, speaking to where Councillor Kiefer was going and looking at electric vehicles, although the incentive that was there isn't quite the same, so it's changed the fiscal dynamic a little more. I know one of the other things, though, that we're doing and that we'll be considering as part of our budget is the grade of diesel that we're using. So going to one that's a little more expensive but actually has a significant impact on GHG reductions. And I'm wondering if, as part of whatever report might come back on the electric vehicles, we can also look at what would the impact be if we did something similar here. And, maybe we phase it in over a couple years. But I think we need to start making some of those inroads if we ever hope to get close to reaching our commitments that we've made as an organization and as a region as a whole, in terms of a number of the municipalities have bought into that. I also have a question in terms of an issue paper that's more capital focused. Is that still coming up, or are you just now going to go into policing and stuff? Should I ask it now, or should I wait?
I do have a small number of slides on issue papers, so why don't I go through those, and then I'll pause when I'm done them, and you can ask that question.
Thanks.
Okay, no further questions, Mr. Dyer?
Okay. Right, and so two other important numbers that are on this page, slide 48 down at the bottom. You can see the revenue generated by a 1% tax increase is $5.2 million. So just the way to look at this is, if we had a budget that was at 2%, the addition of $5.2 million to that budget would make it a 3% budget. And that just allows us kind of a frame of reference as to how significant changes will be over the course of the budget process. And then 1% increase to the average household. So a typical residence in Waterloo Region is just under $20. A couple of numbers that will make sure that stay front and center as we go through the process. So base budget so we're going to talk about base budget pressures, issue papers, and capital. So in no particular order, these are the main items that I just want to touch on. Transit paramedic services, service contracts, Mr. Murray spoke to, so I won't do too much on that. But then infrastructure, development charges, and provincial policy I want to talk about. So there was a reference earlier to annualization. So this table shows, it goes back to 2018. So there's a series of issue papers approved as part of the 2018 budget, largely focused on public transit and paramedic services. And the important numbers here are the ones here being circled. So this is what we refer to as annualization. And this happens when a service enhancement comes into effect at some point through the year. So in 2018, we approved new paramedic services resources effective July 1st. We approved new bus routes effective September the 1st. When we move into the next year, we then have to annualize those costs for the rest of the year to create a full year's worth of costs. So included in the base budget of this year is about $2.4 million of annualization from issue papers approved in the previous year. And so you'll see when we get to the issue papers that we highlight those numbers so that it's clear for council what the implications will be as we head into the 2020 budget. I talked previously about the I guess what I refer to now as the previous transportation master plan. So we had a 8-year funding strategy for stage 1 LRT and for certain Grand River Transit service improvements. And so we had 1.5% tax increases approved over 5 years, 12, 13, 15, 16, and 17. We had 1.25% in 2014 and 2018, and we have 0.75%. The final 0.75% is captured in the 2019 budget. And the idea, the basics of the funding model is that at the end of the funding strategy, there'd be sufficient budget capacity to fund all of the operating and capital costs associated with Stage 1 ION and ABRT, as well as certain Grand River Transit service improvements. And over the period of time, we did have an offset of the provincial upload. So the Ontario Works upload created capacity within municipalities to invest in infrastructure. And that's how this region chose to do it.
So we have a question, I'm assuming, on RTMP. Councillor Galloway?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So on the RTMP, Craig, is there any upload left?
There's not.
There's not.
The upload ended in 2018.
So it's done, right. So so with the 0.75% that's proposed this year, and that's been in the plan for a few years, it's not a new number.
No.
What does that do to our balance in the reserve fund? Does that give us a healthy balance? Is it more than we need? Is it less than we need? And I guess the bottom line question is, can that be reduced or spread out over 2 years? And what would be the impacts?
Yep, so through you, Mr. Chair, I would say the reserve balance could never be more than we need.
Yes, I know.
Oh, well done, Craig.
That being said, the projections that we have show that there's, in the area of $8 to $10 million sitting in that will be in the RTMP reserve over the next couple of years. So there is, I would say, a small balance in that reserve fund. There are many potential draws against and lots of risks as we head into revenue service. So I think it's certainly not too high in this case, I would say. If the question is, is there capacity to put the final increase in a different way? It could certainly be modeled. I think from a staff perspective, I think our recommendation would be this 0.75 is here in part because of reductions in the model from previous years. So it was kind of an add-on.
Yes.
And I think on that basis, and on the basis that we'll be in revenue service in 2019, and with some of those risks, certainly our recommendation would be to do the 0.75% in 2019 and get the funding strategy completed.
Yeah, we took a little holiday in 14 and 18, and that's
correct.
Why we're doing the 7.5 and 19. I understand that, but maybe if I could ask, Mr. Chair, I'd like to see a bit of a continuity schedule on the reserve fund, spreading this out over 2 years. I'm not saying I'm in favor of that. I just kind of want to know what the consequences are. And the 0.75 probably becomes 0.8 or something, I suspect.
Possibly, yes. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
So staying with the major impacts on the 2019 budget, infrastructure funding. So this is something that we will come back to regularly. We have been talking about it for some time now at the region. And I think the bottom line is that the amount of funding we provide each year for capital based on our capital program is not sufficient. And so we've been looking for ways over the last few years to increase the amount of capital works that we're funding directly from the operating budget. We did have a set of capital financing principles approved back in 2016, and the most significant outcome of that was that, you know, we want to make sure we're focusing our borrowing on significant significant infrastructure expansions. Right? So we have part of our capital program that is infrastructure expansion, either because of growth or because of increasing demand, or both. And then we have the state of good repair, the ongoing rehabilitation, renewal, upgrading, replacing. It's that latter piece that we want to not be borrowing for. And we still have a number of areas in our budget where we are borrowing for that kind of work. We want to save, I think, our debt capacity, if you will, our borrowing capacity for some of these more significant service expansion related projects. And so we do have some funding then that we've put into the budget. It goes back to the that original slide. That showed the capital financing and the capital financing related increases in the budget. And so, Mr. Chair, this was the slide that I was referring to. And yes, we can provide more details when we come back next year. When we come back in January with the next budget. So there's basically 4 or 5 components to that increase, ranging from additional asset renewal funding that we have built into the base budget in order to reduce future debt. We had $1 million savings in roads debt servicing costs. This is basically 10-year-old debt that then was retired. We've taken that $1 million and basically reallocated it, repurposed to a direct contribution to fund roads capital works, because we know we have insufficient funding in the roads rehabilitation reserve, and we do have a fairly significant amount of roads-related debt that we would have to issue over the first 5 years. So as a way of mitigating that amount of debt that we'd have to issue, it's in the budget as a contribution for roads capital works. Downtown core exemption funding, I've got a couple more slides on that. It's the incremental $750,000 coming out of the strategy that was approved at the end of 2017. We have some inflation and a little bit of funding for Sunnyside, basically for equipment that's needed, replacement equipment that's needed at Sunnyside, just to make that reserve a little more sustainable. So in total, it's about $4.4 million. We would point out that it will allow us to avoid about $36 million of borrowing over the next 10 years. And if we didn't have to borrow that money, then it would save us about $7.3 million in interest costs over the term of that debt. Downtown core exemptions. So as indicated earlier, the region's downtown core exemption expires on February 28th of 2019. It's currently a full exemption in Cambridge and Kitchener, and a partial, actually a small, very small portion is exempted in Waterloo. That will expire at the end of February of next year. As indicated, because it's a voluntary, discretionary exemption, it has to be funded. Accordingly, Council approved a funding strategy at the end of 2017. We estimated what the total cost of the exemptions would be over a 10-year period, and we have basically 4 pieces to the funding strategy. And the part that affects the budget this year is the roads piece. So roads is the single largest component of our development charge, and so it's the single largest component that has to be funded. Council added $750,000 into the budget in 2018. We've built the next $750,000 into 2019, and anticipating a further $750,000 in 2020. So that would make it about $2.2 million. It would stay in the budget for 10 years, and we would fund the cost of the exemptions over a 10-year period. We've also built in funding into the water and wastewater models. The public transit component will be funded by the RTMP reserve, and then we have a provision of $400,000 sitting in the operating budget that funds all of the other components of the exemption. And again, this is on the basis that as we head towards February 28th, there'll be a significant influx of building permits that will be issued, and that will result in the exemptions which we have to fund over a period of time. Provincial policy and funding, touched on by Mr. Murray in his slides as well. As you saw,
Sorry, Mr. I just need to stop you right there. We have a question from Chair Redmond.
Thank you, Chair Strickland. This probably isn't the slide where it would show up, Craig, but people have asked me on an ongoing basis where we track the revenue when the ION gets started. Where would that show up in the budget projections?
Where would we track the revenue? So you're referring to the fair revenue?
Yes.
Yeah, so the fair revenue will be captured within the overall system revenue within we'll call it in the public transit operating budget.
Okay.
So we have built into the 2019 budget an overall fair revenue number for both GRT and ION. It's about $38 million or so. And we'll see that in the public transit component of the operating budget.
Thanks.
Provincial policy and funding. So we receive, based on the 2018 budget, about $260 million a year in funding from the province. This chart shows how that's changed since 2011. So the observation is that significant, a relatively small increase from 2011 to 2015, a significant increase in provincial funding from 15 to 18. Paramedic services, child care, Ontario Works benefits would have been the most significant components. And the 2019 base budget has been set at $270 million. The challenge, of course, is the uncertainty that we have. The fall economic statement did not provide any direction or guidance as to what might change in 2019, and so how the province might change these numbers is unclear to us at this point. And so in terms of how we've treated it in the operating budget, so on this slide we show where that $270 million is and how the number has changed between 2018 and 19. So 2 observations here. One is most of the numbers are at or near zero. So basically our approach has been we're going to assume for the most part no change in the level of funding that we're going to get from the province until we get some clarity around future direction. Two main exceptions to it. One is the Ontario Works Benefit Program, and this is 100% provincial funding. So this is basically saying we're adjusting the caseload, we're adjusting the cost per case to reflect what we think will happen in 2019, but the cost of the benefits is now 100% paid by the province. So it's not really a risk to the region's budget. This is just an estimate of the total costs and the revenues. Where we do have a bit of risk is on the paramedic services side. And so paramedic services funding has typically, especially in our situation where we've been expanding our service, there's been a 1 to 2 year lag in the provincial funding. So we would put a service enhancement in place in 1 year. Any provincial funding, and the province has been funding on a 50-50 basis, that additional funding wouldn't come to the following year. And then when we would analyze for the full year, we wouldn't get the full amount until the year after that. And so what we're seeing here is a $2.3 million increase in the base as a result of service expansions that were done in 2017 and 2018. It's admittedly, it's a bit of a risk. And again, we have not heard from the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care about what funding for ambulance will look like in the 2019 budget. But overall, pretty much all the other areas at or close to zero. And this is something that, of course, we'll be watching closely as we head into 2019.
Craig, I think it might be useful. I do have a couple speakers, but also, not to be alarmist in the sense that if some of these funding impacts come into play during the 2019 budget, we do have a tax rate stabilization fund with a balance of approximately, I'm going from memory, 15 million?
It's about 13 or 14 right now. Yep,
Yeah.
very close. It has a $15 million cap,
Right.
maximum.
That we put into place a number of years ago as kind of a rainy day fund to help mitigate any of these kind of changes and losses in revenue. All right, so Councillor Foxton.
Thank you, Chair, and I think you answered it. We've already purchased a few ambulances, which we expect money to come in the next year or so. What happens? Can the province claw that back?
So through you, Mr. Chair, bit of a different situation. So the province doesn't fund capital.
Okay.
So when ambulances that we're purchasing, we're buying them. We have a funding strategy for how we buy ambulances. It's all on the operating side.
Okay, so what was it that we're expecting the province to pay for in the next, they backdated a year or two? If it's not the ambulance, what was it? You just talked
All
about
of the operating costs associated with the ambulances.
Okay, so can they claw back any of that?
Yes.
Oh, not
I would say.
Let's try that again. No, the other one is the Ontario Works Benefits Programs. We are doing the increase to 95.7. What happens if the province doesn't meet our demand and we have people that need that funds?
Well, I would say, I guess a couple comments through you, Mr. Chair. So one is, so again, the province is paying 100% of the cost of these benefits. It's their program to set, they set all of the directives and rules around eligibility, around rates, around payments. So we, as a service manager, follow those rules in managing the program on the province's behalf. And we have a mechanism to work out the payments that we make and the funding that we get from the province. So I don't think it would be, so much of an issue of, so what the province could do, I suppose, is change the rules, right? And so if the rules change, and and any province, any provincial government, rules around eligibility, rules around rates, I think they have already announced a previously announced 1.5% rate increase for 2019, and a number of changes that we're expecting to the program that I think we're actually just waiting for the details on right now to see how they're going to roll out in 2019. The one item I might point to here, the line right above the 8.3, the OW administration line. So we've left our OW administration line flat. There's a risk to that number in the same way that there's risks to a bunch of those other numbers on there. I think in any of these situations, the province could say, new funding model, new rules, here's what the funding is going to be in 2019. And then depending on, I guess, the order of magnitude and nature of those changes, staff would report back with, with recommendations as to how to respond and react.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Erb?
Thank you. I think it's been answered, but back to the Ontario Works, 100% funded by the province. So there's no financial implication to the region, but if the numbers go up of recipients, the region then has to make the decision if they're going to fund those?
No. Still a provincial decision about eligibility. Excuse me, about both eligibility and rates are all provincial decisions.
But they could decide not to fund the increase in the growth of people who apply or who would be eligible.
So through you, Mr. Chair. So if they did, that would be a significant backtracking of their, I guess, the previous government's commitment to upload the cost of those benefits. There was a time, I guess going back 10 years now, where municipalities paid 20% of the cost of those benefits, and over a 10 or 12-year period, that has now been fully uploaded to the province. Okay, carrying on. So base budget adjustments, I think generally covered off by Mr. Murray. Just a repeat of that slide. And as committed to earlier, we'll come back with some additional details on the $2.2 million in 2019. Assessment growth. So again, assessment growth is, as a result of new properties being added to the overall assessment base. So here's a 10-year history of assessment growth in the region, with the bar going through there as the 10-year average, which I think is about 1.7, about 1.7%. So we've been above that for the last 2 years now, and this is budget year. So if you look at the 2019 number, it was growth in 2018 for the 2019 budget, is the way to interpret it. Basically at exactly the same level as last year. And I should say that it's actually a net number, right? So you would take the assessment base at the start of the year, you would add on any new properties added, any expansions added, anything that increased the value. But then there are also properties that get appealed, reconsidered, adjustments made that bring the number down. And so all of these numbers on this chart are really a net growth number. The increases reduced in some cases by the decreases. But overall, up almost 2%. So I'd say, 2 really healthy, good, strong years of assessment growth in the region.
Mr. Dyer, I'd just like to point out that it is 2 healthy years of assessment growth, but it also means additional revenue, right? So 1.92%, we're approximately $8 million in new revenue, of 1% equals 5.2. So, and that compared to the assessment growth, say, in 2011 at 2.15, the real numbers, even though it's 2.15, the amount of revenue that generated at 2.15 would be less than what we generated in 2019 at 1.92.
Absolutely.
Right? Because our assessment base has grown over time. So I always think it's important to keep track of what this means in terms of real dollars.
Yep.
And I've asked you before.
And I appreciate your consistency, Mr. Chair. We have the table. We have the table that we prepared for you last year, and we will update it to add the additional year.
All right, okay. Because you know what the definition of madness is. Thank you. Okay, so budget issue papers. Okay, so we've now covered off base budget, major impacts on that budget, a little bit about assessment growth, a little bit about budget adjustments, issue papers. So a number of criteria that we typically look at as from a staff perspective as we're putting together a list of potential issue papers. We look for items that either meet a new legislative or regulatory requirement, if we've had specific direction through a master plan or business plan approval, deals with a health and safety issue, somehow supports the region's strategic plan. So we look to make sure that our issue papers, meet at least one or more of these criteria. And we have, I would say, a somewhat longer list of proposed service enhancements this year than we've had in the last couple of years. You have the package. We will go through these individually at the next meeting in January. This is just a snapshot of some of the issue papers. Some of them I think will come as no surprise. So if we went back through issue papers approved over the last 3 years, predominantly Grand River Transit, paramedic services, and resources at Sunnyside. 2019 budget is no exception. Those are the more significant issue papers being proposed, so additional resources from a Sunnyside perspective, continued implementation of the paramedic services master plan,
additional service hours for Grand River Transit, as well as for the proposed Conestoga College UPass. A number of support-related positions across the region. So as the region grows, as service grows, and additional support positions are required in information technology, in facilities, and in other areas, we've made those requests. A few others, transportation system support and maintenance resources, again, as the overall inventory and network of transportation-related facilities has increased. Total cost of all the issue papers is about $6.3 million, which would have a tax impact of about 1.2%. And then annualization, which I'm going to cover off in this slide. So a few slides ago, we saw the 2018 version of this slide. Here's the 2019 version. So $6.3 million in 2019 as the total cost. If approved, then we'd be adding $3.4 million into the base budget in 2020 from an annualization perspective. So it's just something to keep in mind as committee's doing its review of budget issue papers through the budget process. Some of the examples, so I think I've been through some of these already. GRT service enhancements. It's both the GRT business plan and the Mobility Plus business plan. So new service hours, which means drivers, buses, mechanics, support people, as well as the additional hours related to the proposed Conestoga College UPass. More details about that next month. 2 12-hour ambulances, along with the paramedics and support staff needed to support those positions. Resources, mostly in the form of personal, do definitely have to watch acronyms. PSW, personal support worker, request for personal support workers at Sunnyside, basically relating to the level of care that needs to be provided at Sunnyside Home. On the IT side, a couple of resources for network infrastructure and security. So as the region's network infrastructure grows, we have an increasing need for security resources to ensure that the data that the region has remains safe and to support new projects that are being implemented. So I'm going to pause, Mr. Chair. I think I'll pause there. It might be a good time for Councillor Verbanovich's question about issue papers.
Okay. Good memory, Councillor Verbanovic.
Well, thank you very much. And my question actually has to do with an item in. I'd like to see an issue paper come forward in terms of capital, and it speaks to something that many of us talked about, certainly more than a third of regional council, and certainly the majority of Kitchener and Waterloo councils that were elected, and that was a commitment towards a minimum protected cycling grid in the city, in our respective cities and the region. And I would like to see an issue paper come forward that would look at how we would achieve that over the next 4 years of council, which was something that we had talked about as part of the Cycle Waterloo Region pledge in the recent election, and something that I'd like to certainly in our Kitchener budget that will be coming forward as we start that in January, and looking to explore that here at the region as well.
Maybe I just, I'm not sure, Councillor Verbanovic, if it's a issue paper or you want a task force or something through planning and works to look at implementation of such a plan and what the costs would be.
Well, I guess I think an issue paper at budget time could potentially bring us up to speed in terms of what is already in the budget for some of this work as part of our cycling master plan as a region, and what additional dollars it would take us to achieve this here at the region. I believe much of that work has already been done. and we would just need to look at how we fund it, quite frankly, over the next 4 years.
Yeah.
That may lead into a task force ultimately, and I know we have both an active transportation advisory committee that no doubt will be talking about this, and I know just earlier today, I believe we appointed Councillor Galloway onto a committee for that purpose as well.
Right, yes, I noticed that from this morning also. Mr. Dyer, I know you had a sidebar there with Mr. Murray. You want to add something?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair, I would say I explained earlier what a budget information paper is.
Yeah.
I think this has the makings of a budget issue paper for one. Sorry, budget information paper. I stand corrected. So
Okay.
I think we can bring back some information with respect to this issue as part of one of the next budget committee meetings.
Yeah, I guess germane to that too would be how much in our roads capital budget or wherever it is, how much is allocated towards cycling infrastructure, and how much of that is segregated bike lanes. So I think we need to get down to that number, and then if council wants to maybe make a notional allocation to increase that for future development of an appropriate grid, then we can have that discussion. Sure. Sorry.
That we don't know is, I mean, there was funding that was potentially available provincially for this. That funding is no longer available going forward. But we also know that the federal minister responsible for environment and climate change has indicated that Ontario's share of dollars will be coming to municipalities, schools, universities, and the bus sector directly. We don't know what that's going to look like yet. But I think we also want to, I mean, part of this is making sure we're ready to take advantage of that opportunity when those dollars become available. And I think it was something to the tune of $400 million across Ontario, I believe, is what she said.
Okay. So we'll get an information paper back on that.
Yes.
So I have several speakers. I have Clark, Galloway, Shantz, and Redmond. So what I propose is, anyone want to speak to this issue on the cycling grid? Councillor Galloway? All right, so I'll go to Councillor Galloway first.
Well, I want to speak to this. I had another item that I'd actually...
No, just one item at a time.
Okay. Well, I was flashing, which I thought meant I was next in line. So, anyway... So I did want to comment on that, what Councillor Vanovic has brought up. I think we're doing a lot of work already, but it's in different pockets, and I think we need to bring focus on a budget basis to the active transportation file. And I think that information paper is a great idea to try to pull all the various pieces together of what we're already doing, and then council is in a better position to decide, well, that's what we are doing, so what more do we want to do? And of course, how do we budget for that? Because I think it is an important piece that we need to bring more focus to generally, whether it's some commitment to this, whatever, you know, the system or segregated lanes or whatever it is. So I certainly agree to us doing that and doing it in the form of an information paper, because I think while we no doubt will be talking about this as well during our strategic planning process, and there may be other things that come out of that, I think we want to move a little more quickly on this as compared to waiting for the strategic plan, which is going to be 6 months from now or whatever before we finalize that. And of course, it'll be a major consideration. It'll be quite instructive to the 2020 budget. On the other matter is the GRT, the GRT matter, and I'm just curious as to what funding assumptions or what revenue assumptions were used. So on the revenue side, Mr. Dyer, so we are over budget on our GRT revenues. That's a good thing in this case. Are we projecting that to continue plus, or how did we project the revenues?
Yep. So through you, Mr. Chair, so we've taken the estimated year-end fair revenue actuals for 2018 and used that as our starting point for the 2019 budget. So we've assumed, so basically we start with our projection for this year. We add on some annualization of revenue from service enhancements that were made in the fall of last year. We have built into the base budget a proposed 3% fare increase on July 1st of 2018, and then reflected additional fare revenue relating to ION in the budget as well. We've got a little chart on that, which we can also bring forward at the next meeting.
And the UPass revenue is in there too?
And so the UPass revenue is not in the base. It's captured in a budget issue paper. So you'll see in the budget issue paper package, you'll see a specific Conestoga College UPass issue paper that captures the costs, the number of buses needed, and the estimated fare revenue as well.
That's fair. So did you project a ridership increase on conventional transit?
Ridership increase on conventional transit related to the increase that we've seen so far this year, yes.
Only related?
Well, and then I would say the incremental revenue that's contemplated as part of the ION operation in effect in the spring of 2019.
Okay, so just to be clear, so we've had a good year on ridership, we've had a good year on revenues.
Yep.
So you've projected that for next year, but you've not added another 2%, 3% increase in ridership on conventional transit as some kind of a trend line that's trending upwards. You've not made an assumption in that regard.
I would say not specifically in that form, but there is incremental fare revenue built into the system, again, as a result of the ION service plan for the spring. So we may have gotten at it we may have accomplished what you're asking for, but just in a slightly different way. And again, as I said earlier, we're looking at it from an overall system-wide perspective, right? So looking at the total revenue we generated in 18, adding on for the items that I just referred to, adding on for additional ridership as a result of the implementation of ION. So I think we're doing what you're asking, but just in a slightly different way.
Well, we'll look at that more closely. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, trying to get the 4% down. Do that by cutting costs or increasing revenues. And I know that you're naturally conservative on the revenue side, particularly. So I'm trying to figure out, if we've had a 2% increase in revenues this year, just on conventional transit, and there's some kind of trend line on ridership going up, and we might expect that to continue through 2019. Maybe that's another $1 million. Maybe I don't know. I'm just questioning. And quite apart from what happens with ION and the synergy between ION and conventional transit, which may have its own impacts, hopefully, in terms of increased ridership. But let's just say, conventional transit on its own.
Yep. So what I might say, Mr. Chair, is, once we get into the latter part of January, we'll have the ridership and revenue numbers to the end of the year, so we can, I think, quite conceivably take another look at the assumptions and estimates in late January, early February, and if there's the basis for making a further adjustment to fare revenue, we'll have an opportunity, I think, both at the February 6th and February 19th meetings to have that discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Dyer, just further to that, I think it'd be useful to have an information paper highlighting all our major sources of revenue and what the estimated actual is. So, POA, red light cameras, tonnage, tipping, all our major sources of revenue, and what the estimated actual is for 18 and what is in the budget for 19. So
absolutely. It's very easily done, and just thinking out loud here a little bit, Mr. Chair, we can incorporate that into our first look at user fees and charges for 2019, which we'll do at one of the meetings in January.
Because we may want to forecast a little bit more aggressively and
Absolutely.
Recoup some more revenue, because I know we did that on POA and it worked out quite nicely this year. Right? Okay, Councillor Schatz.
Thank you. In terms of ambulance service, did we, excuse me, did we budget, or is there anything included in here for support at the hospital for offload delay? I think we had talked about that, and I don't remember where we ended up with that discussion, but rather than just looking at increasing ambulances, but also the other end of that issue.
I think, so let me just try this. I think, we do in the budget have the resource and I think the funding for the offload delay nurses at the hospitals, and we receive then funding from the province to offset that cost. I'm not aware that there's anything over and above that, but I can confirm that.
Okay, thank you. Seat 27, is that you, Mike? All right, Mr. Murray.
Just to add to that, so yeah, we'll check on that. In addition to that, though, we are working closely with senior staff at the hospitals. I've got meetings coming up with two of the incumbent hospital CEOs to talk about how can we work better together to deal with offload delays. So there's a funding piece, but I also think there's looking at our practices and their practices and how can we get a handle on offload delays.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Chair Redmond.
Thank you, Chair Strickland. I think I'm going to fall under the information paper request. And it's further to one of the comments that Councillor Vrbanovich talked about, and that's our commitment to reduce by 80% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And that's to look at the kind of diesel that we buy, and if there's any room in our bus acquisition to look at electric buses and what kind of infrastructure we'd have to consider in order to have those charging facilities.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Mr. Dyer, carry on.
So what I've this is a repeat of the earlier slide, just as a reminder. So overall base budget position, excluding issue papers and police service budgets, at 1.85%. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about capital. So this is the tax-supported capital program. I mentioned earlier that the water and wastewater capital program is about $1 billion over 10 years. Tax-supported capital program is $2.3 billion over 10 years, and covers all of the major services, non-water and wastewater services that we provide, predominantly roads rehabilitation and expansion, life cycle work, whatever you want to call it, asset renewal, state of good repair work at our facilities and at our housing sites, buses and facilities and infrastructure for Grand River Transit, work at the landfill site, and transfer stations, vehicles and facilities for paramedics, and of course work at the airport as well. I mentioned earlier that we distinguish between both funding and financing. It's an important distinction. From a funding perspective, we have three main sources of funding. The first is grants and subsidies, and basically those are just contributions that we receive, typically from other levels of government, occasionally from third parties. We also have development charges, and we use those development charges in one of two ways. We collect development charges, they go into a reserve. We can fund projects directly from that reserve, or we can borrow to fund the cost of the project, and then we fund the debt servicing costs from development charge reserves. And then similarly on the property tax side, we can use money out of the current year property tax levy to fund directly to capital. We can use reserves that we may have accumulated from previous years, and we can borrow and fund the debt servicing costs from future property taxes. So when we're building a financing plan for an overall almost $3.5 billion capital program, we're taking into account both what are the funding sources and what is the mechanism to actually do the financing. We've seen some fairly significant changes to this year's capital program compared to last year's, most of which I think I've already talked about. The introduction of the Police Facilities Accommodation Master Plan, and a major project starting in 2019 will be the renovation of the former provincial courthouse at 200 Frederick that we purchased a couple of years ago. We've adjusted the timing of some of the airport master plan projects. We've had a transportation master plan update that is now reflected in the capital program. And we have, this falls into the uncertainty piece, some uncertainty around federal and provincial infrastructure funding. And so the uncertainty relates to I would say the new provincial government's position with respect to bilateral agreements signed just prior to the provincial election back in June. And there was a couple of them. There was one for the National Housing Strategy, which is a $40 billion countrywide program. We're waiting to see how that program is going to be rolled out, what funding the province is going to provide, and how that translates into funding for municipalities. Similarly, with respect to public transit, we have the potential for $341 million of public transit-related funding over a 10-year period. Originally contemplated to be funded 40% by the federal government, 33% by the province, and 27% by municipalities. We're still waiting for confirmation about how the program is going to roll out, what eligibility is going to look like, and what the application process is going to be. So it is an unknown for us. We have made some assumptions, particularly on the transit side, that infrastructure funding for transit is going to play out largely as contemplated. That could be a bit of a risk depending on the approach that the new provincial government plans to take. I'm going to pass on that slide because some of the data hasn't come in, so we'll deal with it next time. So when we look at debt servicing costs over the next 10 years, you can see. So this is based on our capital program and the debt that we're proposing to issue over the next 10 years. I think that there's two main issues for us, both of which I've already referred to. One is additional funding is required in the operating budget to fund projects directly without borrowing. This is our asset renewal work. And on the development charges side, we have a fairly significant amount of growth-related debt that we're proposing to issue over the next 5 years. And that is something that we will tackle as we go through the upcoming background study. And this chart on page 75 here just shows the areas that we're most concerned about in terms of long-term borrowing. We have significant portions of facilities management, waste management, airport, to a lesser extent Grand River Transit, where we don't have adequate sources of funding within the operating budget, and that if service expansion is going to happen, then borrowing is going to be our only option. I've also circled the housing one here. It's a bit of a different issue. We do have a housing capital reserve. Our challenge right now is that reserve doesn't have a ongoing consistent source of funding. So at this point, that reserve will be fully utilized within the first 5 years of the capital program. And if we're going to continue to do renewal work on the 2,700 housing units that we own and operate, we need to identify an additional funding source going forward.
Sorry, do I have a question, Councillor Galloway?
Just going back, Mr. Chair, to the debt servicing cost projection, would it be easily provided, Craig, to see debt costs as a percentage of the operating budget, or the combined budgets of the operating and user rates?
Yes, it would be. We certainly have plenty of historical data, so we can see what the trends have been over the last number of years, and we should be able to include a 2019 budget number as well.
So this graph, of course, is showing it going up. I suspect that as a percentage of our operating budget, it's still going up, but maybe not quite as steeply.
Yes, and so we have, through provincial regulation, we have what's referred to as an annual debt repayment limit. That kind of sets a ceiling on our debt servicing costs at 25% of our revenues we're currently at about 10%. And I'd say we've increased from, say, 6 or 7% up to 10% over the last 3 or 4 years.
Okay.
But we have that chart. It's easy to reproduce for next time.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Craig.
Okay, we're in the home stretch, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Capital financing principles I'm going to leave till, I think, till the next one. Borrowing considerations, I should touch on this a bit. You know, anytime we're making a decision about whether to borrow money or not, we've got to think about, okay, anytime we borrow, we've got debt servicing costs to pay over the next 10, 15, 20 years, depending on the term of the debt. We want to make sure that we're not restricting our flexibility in the future, right? We don't want to issue so much debt that a significant portion of our budget is consumed by debt servicing costs. We do have a number of legislative provisions that we have to meet through the Municipal Act. We can only borrow for capital, right? We do not borrow for operating. The Act limits our ability to borrow specifically for capital projects. And then the need for balance. And this is a balance between funding out of our operating budget and borrowing and creating a cost that's going to hit future operating budgets. So key messages. We're trying to build operating budget capacity to finance capital. As interest rates increase, that means we're going to have higher debt servicing costs. They seem to be, you know, staying relatively low right now. This is the key one, right? Working towards financing all of our asset renewal work from non-debt sources. This is the kind of debt that we don't want to issue. And that's where we're going to be focused, certainly over the next 4 years, on building up that capacity. And that allows us to focus our debt on significant new infrastructure. And the way to do that is through an asset renewal funding strategy, which we'll go through in some detail next time. A couple of quick slides on the police. So this is the current status of the police budget as presented to the board back in November. It's about has a property tax requirement or a levy of $171 million, a $10 million or 6.4% increase over last year. And that translates into an additional 1.4% increase on the overall regional tax bill. The board has provided, if I understand it, instructions to staff to come back with some revisions to the budget, which they'll consider, I believe, at their meeting in January, possibly as soon as this month. My understanding is that approval of the 2019 budget would take place on January 19th, and then the police will be here to make a presentation at the budget committee meeting scheduled for February 6th. Public input, we're still working on. We have, over the last couple of years, increased the form and types and opportunities of public input during the budget process. There will be 2 public input sessions planned for the new year, as well as additional opportunities through Engage Waterloo Region to provide input into the budget. We also, last year, we created a video about municipal budgeting. We were going to show it today, but we thought it was going to be a long enough day already. We'll send you all the link to that video. It's 3 or 4 minutes long, way shorter than this presentation today. And we're still in the process of figuring out exactly how public input will happen, and we'll bring some information back again in the early part of the new year. The proposed schedule, which is an attachment to the report on the agenda today, contemplates 3 more budget committee meetings. One on January 16th will be a busy day. We'll have a lot of ground to cover. User rate, operating and capital budgets, a presentation from the GRCA, more information about budget issue papers and capital projects in particular. We're targeting February 6th to approve the user rate budgets, and then February 19th to approve the tax-supported budget, both operating and capital. And again, just our key messages around the context, economic indicators, some uncertainty around provincial funding, clear focus on asset renewal funding over the next 4 years. Service expansions will be key, as well as provincial subsidy and policy. And we've talked about some of the increases we have on the base side through utilities, fuel, and service contracts. Current position, excluding issue papers, at 1.85%. We've updated the capital program to reflect a whole bunch of master plan approvals in 2018, and again, the need for additional funding for state of good repair. I think we've already been through all the different items we're going to talk about on January 16th, including the requests that have come out of this meeting so far in the form of information papers. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to entertain any final questions. And thank you for your attention and interest.
Thank you, Craig. Councillor Galloway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Craig, maybe I missed it and maybe there are none, but have staff identified any opportunities to use the tax stabilization reserve fund for a sustainable purpose, as we have done in other years on occasion?
Yep. Through you, Mr. Chair, I think there are two that come to mind. So we do have make sure I get this right, in the public transit operating budget, we still have a little bit of tax stabilization funding relating to the redeployment of service hours once ION becomes operational. If you think back, I think maybe 2 budgets ago, when we approved Grand River Transit service expansions in a couple of different bundles, and one of those bundles had a tax stabilization reserve component to it. There's still a piece of that built into the 2019 budget, which would then come out in 2020.
I was looking for new opportunities.
Okay, well, let me do the second one. The second example is in the paramedic services budget issue paper,
right.
As a way of phasing in our assumption about incremental provincial funding.
Last year or the year before.
We have done that for a couple of years now. Beyond that, I don't believe at this point we have any other proposed use of the tax stabilization reserve.
Is that because there are none, or
well, yeah,
you just haven't identified any, or
no? I would say that. I would say again through you, Mr. Chair, that what we're proposing through the operating budget are ongoing costs which should be funded from the levy. So there's nothing immediately that's coming to mind that suggests that there are other, kind of short-term uses for the tax stabilization reserve, but we can certainly give it some thought.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Clark.
Thanks. I'm kind of going in the opposite direction. I'm looking at reducing our revenues. We've heard that staff are going to be looking at a 3% fare increase for transit, but we also heard that OW and ODSP are going up 1.5%, and that the CPI is 2 to 2.5%. So, can we get some information on what a 2% fare increase would do?
Yes.
Whether that's an information paper or just part of the presentation.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We got another question, Councillor Erb.
I apologize for a question that we dealt with a little bit earlier, but it's back on page 48 with the regional share of the assessment growth, where there was a reduction of 132. But then on a further slide where it showed the average assessment growth, it was 1.9%.
Yep. So the total, yep. So good question. So the total increase overall for the assessment base in 2018 for the 2019 budget is 1.92%. That's how much the assessment base increased. For the purpose of calculating the tax rate impacts between region and police, we simply allocate it to the two. So it's just a breakdown of the 1.92% is broken down to about 1.3 something for the region and the balance on the police side. And the only reason we do that is for the purpose of calculating tax rate impacts. That's all. The number you should remember is the 1.92%. That's the important number.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Dyer, and thanks to committee for all your questions. And
thank you.
Off to a good start today. Good job. We do have a couple of recommendations we need to pass that are on our agenda. So we can have a mover and seconder for those, please. Councillor Foxton, Councillor Nowak, all those in favor? That's carried. Thank you. Next meeting, January 16th. I hope you all come back. And motion to adjourn. Councillor Harris, Councillor Armstrong, all those in favor? We're adjourned. Thanks very much, everyone.